You were cast out, not because you were broken, but because you refused to break the way they needed you to. In families shaped by narcissism, exile isn't punishment. It's proof. Proof that you were the one who saw too much, felt too much, refused to contort into a shape that made everyone else comfortable. You were ejected from the system because you saw the system for what it was. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre warned that bad faith is when we betray our truth just to maintain the peace. But you didn't do that. You saw the dysfunction and refused to disappear into it. And that kind of clarity, they treated it like a threat. If you were the one who got blamed while others stayed quiet, if you always felt like the emotional dumping ground, if your very existence seemed to provoke shame, rage, or rejection, this video is for you. It won't be easy, but we're going to expose the real reason you were scapegoated, and why that role, painful as it was, may be the first sign you were free. We'll unpack the psychology of projection, the philosophy of exile, and why in systems built on denial, truth becomes the target. Because the scapegoat was never the problem. They were the evidence. In dysfunctional families, especially narcissistic ones, pain must be outsourced. The shame they refuse to feel, the anger they won't process, the grief they've buried under decades of denial. It has to land somewhere. So they choose a carrier, someone to absorb the dysfunction and carry it out of sight. That someone was you. You didn't just get blamed. You were assigned blame, preloaded, scripted, positioned as the emotional sponge. And when you pushed back, that only confirmed their choice. Because systems like this don't reward honesty. They punish it. Bell Hooks once wrote, "What we cannot confront in ourselves, we demonize in others." You became the demon. Not because you were bad, but because they couldn't face what your presence revealed about them. In family systems theory, this is called projective identification. The family unconsciously loads their own denied traits onto one member, then treats them as if those traits were real. It's not just scapegoating. It's a shared hallucination held in place by collective denial. You were cast as the problem. And once that label stuck, everything you did, every protest, every emotion, was reinterpreted as proof. Even your growth became threatening. Because when a scapegoat starts healing, the system feels exposed. Over time, that rejection doesn't just hurt, it rewires you. You start apologizing for your instincts, you question your memory, you feel guilty for needing anything at all. Not because you were wrong, but because the system needed you to feel wrong. In Kierkegaard's words, the greatest torture is to be understood wrongly, especially when the misunderstanding is permanent. You weren't just misunderstood, you were intentionally miscast. And that miscasting became your mirror. Let's take a moment to reflect. What truth about your family did you become evidence for? And how did they punish you for it? But here's the question the family never once answered. If you were always the problem, why are you the only one breaking the cycle? Because exile wasn't your ending. It was your exit. In the next section, we'll dissect why the scapegoat always becomes the one who walks away, and what that reveals about the system they left behind. You didn't end up the scapegoat by accident. You were selected because you posed the greatest threat to the illusion. In narcissistic family systems, roles are assigned based on utility, not identity. Golden child, mascot, lost child, scapegoat, each serves a function, but only one holds the truth. And the scapegoat? That's the one who sees the toxicity. As trauma expert Gabor Mate explains, when a child learns to attune to others' needs before recognizing their own, it's not caretaking, it's survival. And in dysfunctional systems, that survival strategy makes them the perfect scapegoat. According to Bowen's family systems theory, dysfunctional families operate like closed emotional units. What is unspoken must remain unspoken. Any attempt to disrupt that by questioning, confronting, or even just feeling is experienced as betrayal. And so the scapegoat becomes the emotional lightning rod. Your pain gets pathologized, your truth gets distorted, your rebellion becomes rage, your sorrow becomes manipulation. Why? Because if your story is real, their version collapses. And when image matters more than intimacy, truth must be discredited at any cost. In a narcissistic household, the family narrative is curated like propaganda. Look how well we've done. Look how great our kids are. Look how close we are as a family. But that closeness, it's built on complicity. And when one member refuses to stay silent, they're not seen as brave. They're labeled ungrateful, disrespectful, crazy. The narcissist's greatest fear is exposure. So they isolate the one person who might expose them, the one who remembers, the one who refuses to perform, the one who sees clearly and won't look away. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. You were punished not for lying, but for refusing to. You became the cycle breaker because you couldn't fake it, couldn't suppress what your body knew was real, couldn't stay in the role they cast you in. And that resistance, it cost you everything, but it gave you something else. A chance to build a self not sculpted by shame." But let's not romanticize it. Being the scapegoat isn't empowering, it's devastating. Because it's not just rejection, it's reality distortion. You're gaslit out of your own memories. You question your intuition. You over-apologize for existing. You play every scene of the past in your head, trying to prove you weren't the villain they made you out to be. You start to internalize the script. Maybe I am too emotional, too difficult, too much. This is the trauma of misidentification. Not being misunderstood, but being fundamentally mislabeled in the very system that raised you. Pause here to reflect. What version of you did they invent, so they wouldn't have to face what they did? What part of your truth did they punish the moment it surfaced? But here's what no one tells you. The more you heal, the more their story stops making sense. Next, we'll explore what happens when the scapegoat steps out of the role, and why breaking the cycle means rebuilding an identity from scratch. Let's dive in. The scapegoat role only works if you stay in it, if you keep explaining, keep apologizing, keep trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. But when you stop playing along, when you stop justifying, defending, or begging to be seen, you don't just shift the dynamic, you collapse their illusion. Family systems theory teaches us that every role exists to preserve emotional equilibrium, no matter how dysfunctional that equilibrium is. And the scapegoat? They're the pressure valve. They absorb the discomfort. They carry the unresolved shame. They're punished for disrupting the performance, But what happens when the scapegoat stops participating? The system destabilizes, not because you caused harm, but because you stopped containing it. In narcissistic families, your compliance was never about harmony. It was about control. And your rebellion? It wasn't just disobedience. It was a declaration. I won't carry what doesn't belong to me anymore. That single act of no longer taking the blame becomes the most dangerous form of resistance. Because once the scapegoat stops absorbing dysfunction, everyone else has to face what's been deflected. Heidegger wrote that authenticity is our confrontation with nothingness. When the scapegoat sheds the role, they meet the void and choose to fill it with their own truth. But freedom doesn't feel freeing at first. It feels like grief, because once you step out of the role, the real losses begin. You lose false connection. You lose scripted approval. You lose access to a family that only loved you as long as you played the villain. And in that void, something terrifying happens. You have to meet the you beneath the scapegoat. The you that was buried under blame. The you that never got to exist on their own terms. Simone Weil once wrote, "To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. But the scapegoat was never rooted. You were isolated, not because you were wrong, but because you were honest. And when honesty threatens the hierarchy, exile becomes the reward. You weren't cast out for what you did. You were cast out for who you refused to become. So now what? You have no role, no reward, no approval, just you. The truth you carry, the pain you've unpacked, the stories you've stopped living. This is where the real work begins. Not to be reaccepted, but to reclaim the self that was never mirrored back. Take a moment to think about your situation. What part of you are you still trying to prove to people who need you wrong to feel right? But here's what they'll never admit. The scapegoat doesn't just walk away. They walk forward. And in doing so, they become the first one to tell the truth without asking for permission. Next, we uncover why the scapegoat is the first to break the cycle, but also the first to pay for it. Because healing, in systems like this, looks like betrayal. Let's unpack that now. Most scapegoats spend years wondering, why was it me? Why did they turn on me? Why didn't anyone else see what was happening? But the truth is more unsettling. You weren't targeted because you were the problem. You were targeted because you saw the problem and refused to pretend it wasn't there. Systems of dysfunction run on collective denial. And in a narcissistic family, denial isn't just convenient, it's survival. They don't want the truth. They want consistency, predictability, control. Your awareness disrupted that. You named what they needed, buried. You remembered what they wanted, erased. You spoke the words that made silence impossible. In a system built on illusions, reality is the true threat. Carl Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. That includes vilifying the one person brave enough to hold up the mirror. As the scapegoat, you weren't just punished for what you saw. You were punished for refusing to unsee it. This is what philosophers call epistemic exile. Being cast out not for breaking a rule, but for breaking the silence. Sartre called bad faith a kind of living self-betrayal, internalized lies that silence authenticity. The scapegoat breaks that code and is punished for truth. But seeing the truth comes at a cost, because once you see the manipulation, the gaslighting, the cycles that repeat in every generation, you can't go back to pretending. You can't unknow the moment you realized their love was conditional. You can't unhear the silence that followed every boundary you tried to set. And you can't unfeel the moment you finally realized they didn't want healing. They wanted hierarchy. Nietzsche wrote, "Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed." And that's what your presence threatened, not because you attacked them, but because you revealed them. You made the system conscious, and conscious systems have to change, or they have to eliminate the threat. That's why they made you the enemy, not for what you did, but for what you represented. Proof that something was broken, long before you named it. Take a moment to reflect. What truth did you carry that they needed you to forget? But here's what they never expected, that the one they cast out would be the one strong enough to end it. Because breaking the cycle means being the first to feel what they avoided. This is the part where it all changes. We'll look at what happens when the scapegoat chooses healing over legacy, and why freedom in these systems always feels like grief. They'll say you changed, that you became distant, cold, ungrateful. But what really happened was this: you stopped performing the role. You stopped absorbing the blame. You stopped bleeding just to keep the family narrative intact. And when you did, the system fractured. Not because you were cruel, but because you were clear. Here's what they don't tell you about healing. It doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like loss. Loss of identity. Loss of belonging. Loss of the illusion that if you were just good enough, they'd finally see you. Because being the scapegoat gave you a role. And roles, even painful ones, feel like purpose. When you walk away, you lose the very thing that anchored you to them, even if that thing was suffering. Pete Walker describes the fawn response as the compulsion to appease in order to survive. As the scapegoat, you weren't just fawning to survive abuse, you were fawning to stay connected, because in trauma-bonded families, love is transactional, silence is rewarded, truth is punished. So when you finally speak up or walk away, your nervous system interprets it as danger, not liberation. That's why healing feels like heartbreak, because it is. You're mourning who they never were and who you had to be to survive them. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. You didn't choose this role, but now you're choosing your exit. And with it comes grief. Grief for the childhood that never came, the apologies that never arrived, the relationship that existed only in your hope, not your history. But grief is not weakness. Grief is proof you stopped gaslighting yourself. It means the spell is broken. You started mourning them, not because they died, but because the version of them you needed never existed." Pause here for a moment. What part of you still waits for the apology you know will never come? How much of your healing is still paused, waiting for them to make it right? If you stopped waiting for their apology, what would you finally give yourself? Here's where everything changes, because freedom isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about what you finally make room for. In the final section, we'll dismantle the biggest lie of all, that your worth came from the role. Because once you reclaim your truth, you stop inheriting their pain. You start writing something new. Carl Jung said, "Individuation begins with becoming aware of the unconscious's hold." You ceased serving their system and began orienting to your own psyche. Here's the truth no one in that family could say out loud. You didn't break the system, you revealed it. Every accusation was projection. Every punishment was a defense mechanism, because your clarity made their denial unbearable, and your refusal to stay silent wasn't betrayal. It was evidence, evidence of everything they buried, everything they denied, everything they did, but never admitted. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This isn't victimhood, it's revival. That's what you did. You stopped waiting, stopped pleasing, stopped bleeding for a version of love that only existed if you disappeared. You realized you were never going to be accepted in a room that required your silence to stay comfortable. So you chose exile over erasure. What narcissistic systems fear most is the person who no longer needs to belong to survive. They don't know how to control someone who stops performing, someone who walks away without needing them to change, because freedom threatens control, and your autonomy, your refusal to keep carrying their shame, exposes just how much of their power was built on fear, not love. Let's pause here to reflect, one last time. If you no longer needed them to change, who would you finally be allowed to become? What version of you has been waiting in silence, hoping their love would one day make sense? Who are you without their story shaping your worth? You're not broken. You're breaking cycles, because the scapegoat was never the problem. They were the proof that the problem existed. Viktor Frankl taught that our true freedom begins when we stop waiting for validation and start validating ourselves. If you had to lose everything to finally find yourself, if you became the cycle breaker but paid for it in silence, grief, or exile, comment below, "I broke the cycle, but it broke me first." Because this pain has a purpose, not to punish you, but to prove you survived what others couldn't even name. Your healing isn't loud, but it is revolutionary, and it begins when you stop explaining and start existing.